His mother said I was too poor to sit at their table at Christmas. I excused myself, made one phone call, and came back. Nobody at that table knew the company paying their salaries had my name on the deed. His mother said I was too poor to sit at their table at Christmas. I excused myself quietly, stepped into the hallway, and made one phone call. It lasted 4 minutes. When I walked back through that dining room door, I sat down, unfolded my napkin, and said nothing. Nobody at that table knew that the company signing their paychecks, the company whose logo was printed on the wine glasses in the cabinet behind them, had my name on the founding deed. That was December 23rd. By December 26th, 3 of them no longer had jobs. My name is Renata Osei. I am 34 years old, and I grew up in a 2-bedroom apartment in Akron, Ohio, with my mother, my younger brother Marcus, and the particular kind of discipline that comes from watching someone stretch a grocery budget like taffy. My mother worked 2 jobs for most of my childhood. She kept a small notebook in her apron pocket where she tracked every dollar, not because she was anxious, but because she was precise. That precision was the inheritance she gave me. I went to Ohio State on a merit scholarship. I studied finance. After graduation, I moved to Atlanta and spent 4 years at a mid-sized private equity firm, learning how money actually moves, not the textbook version, but the real one, the version where relationships and paperwork and timing matter more than any formula. At 27, I left that firm, took the small amount I had saved, and became a silent co-founder in a logistics technology company called Aldrin Ventures with my mentor, a man named Douglas Aldrin, who had been in freight and supply chain for 30 years and needed someone who could build the financial architecture he never had time to learn. Silent is the key word. My name was on the founding documents, on the equity agreement, on the LLC registration. It was not in the press releases. It was not on the website. Douglas was the face. I was, as he called me once in a meeting, the reason the foundation doesn't crack. Aldrin Ventures grew, slowly at first, then the way things tend to grow when the infrastructure is solid, quickly and in multiple directions at once. By the time I was 31, we had 140 employees across 3 states. By 32, we had signed contracts with 2 national retail chains and a regional hospital network for supply chain management services. I had equity, real equity, the kind with a dollar amount attached that I had never said out loud to anyone except my accountant and my mother. I also had Daniel Whitmore. I met Daniel at a charity gala in Atlanta, the kind of event where the tablecloths cost more than my first car, and everyone is performing a version of themselves they practiced. He was a structural engineer, tall, careful with his words, the kind of man who listened to finish sentences rather than to start his own. We talked for 2 hours about nothing consequential, and then exchanged numbers, and I drove home, thinking about the way he had looked at me like I was the most interesting thing in the room. Not the most impressive, just the most interesting. That distinction mattered to me. We dated for a year before I met his family. That is not an accident. Daniel knew from very early on that his family was a complicated subject. He came from Marietta, old suburban money, the kind that has been in one zip code long enough to mistake geography for superiority. His father, Gerald Whitmore, had run a regional insurance company for 25 years. His mother, Pamela Whitmore, had never worked in the traditional sense and had built, instead, a very precise social architecture around who belonged, where, and why. Daniel had 2 sisters, Caroline and Beth, both married into the same general tax bracket, both fluent in the language of polite diminishment. Daniel warned me, not in dramatic terms. He said, "My mother measures people. Just be aware of that." He said it the way you say something when you're hoping it won't matter, when you're betting on the best version of someone. I appreciated the warning. I filed it, and I chose to show up as exactly who I was, which was a woman from Akron with good manners, good shoes, and no interest in performing for anyone. The first dinner was Thanksgiving, the year before the Christmas I am about to describe. It went the way first dinners go when the verdict has already been quietly decided. Pamela was gracious in the specific way that costs nothing and gives nothing. Gerald asked what I did, and when I said private equity and logistics, he nodded with the expression of a man who has heard words he doesn't intend to follow up on. Caroline asked where I went to undergrad, and when I said Ohio State, she said, "Oh," with a pause after it. That was its own sentence. Beth smiled at me twice during dinner in the particular way that means I feel sorry for you. Daniel held my hand under the table during dessert. I noticed. I drove home and called my mother and said, "They're a project." She laughed and said, "Every family worth keeping is." I carry a business card that is not a business card. It is matte black, heavier than standard cardstock, with my name in small silver print, and below it 2 lines. Aldrin Ventures, LLC, co-founder and chief financial officer. Douglas had them made for me years ago. I almost never use them because I almost never need to explain myself in a room, but I keep one in my wallet behind my license, the way you keep an emergency key. Not because you plan to use it, because you want to know it's there. That card was in my wallet on December 23rd. Daniel and I had been together 2 years by that December. We were, in all the ways that mattered, building something real. He had met my mother 3 times, and she had told me privately, after the 3rd visit, that he was a good man, but that I should watch how he handled his family, because a man's relationship with his mother is a map of his relationship with discomfort. She was not wrong. She rarely is. The Christmas gathering was at Gerald and Pamela's house in Marietta, a large colonial with a circular driveway and the kind of Christmas decorations that required professional installation. Daniel and I arrived at 6. His sisters were already there with their husbands, Greg and Tom, both of whom worked in some capacity at Gerald's insurance company. I learned that evening that so did Pamela's younger brother, Ray, who had joined the firm 5 years prior in an operations role, and so did Caroline's oldest friend from college, a woman named Stephanie, who had been hired in marketing 2 years ago on what Ray described, without irony, as the family pipeline. Gerald's company, Whitmore Regional Insurance, had been acquired 18 months earlier, acquired by a larger logistics and enterprise services group. I had known this. I had known it in the specific way that I sometimes know things before they become relevant, sitting in the back of my mind like a file I haven't opened yet. The company that acquired Whitmore Regional was a subsidiary of Aldrin Ventures. I had not told Daniel this, not because I was hiding it, but because it had not yet been the right moment, and because I had wanted, more than I can explain, to be seen as a person before I was seen as a resource. Daniel knew I had equity in Aldrin. He knew I was well compensated. He did not know the specific shape of that equity, or what it meant in terms of actual organizational reach. I had planned to tell him over New Year's, quietly, just the two of us. Then Pamela Whitmore opened her mouth at the Christmas dinner table. We were 9 at dinner. The dining room was formal, candlelit, with a table that seated 12, and the china pattern I recognized as Wedgwood. Gerald sat at the head. Pamela sat at the other end, which meant she functioned as the second fulcrum of every conversation, able to redirect or terminate any topic with the precision of someone who had been running rooms her entire adult life. Dinner started well enough. Conversation was the usual Whitmore inventory: Gerald's golf handicap, Greg's recent promotion, Beth and Tom's kitchen renovation, Caroline's children's school performances. I contributed where it was natural, asked questions I was genuinely curious about, and kept my responses measured. Daniel was beside me. His knee was touching mine under the table. Then Pamela asked about the wedding. Daniel and I were not engaged. This was a preemptive strike disguised as small talk, the kind that creates an expectation in a room and then watches what happens to the people inside it. Daniel handled it well. He said they were taking their time and that we were both focused on our work. Pamela smiled in a way that didn't reach her eyes and said, "Of course, though at your age, Daniel, time is something to be thoughtful with." Then she turned to me, and this is the part I have replayed, not with anger anymore, but with a kind of clinical precision, the way you replay something that taught you exactly how a certain species of person operates. She said, "Renata, we've never quite understood what it is you do. Daniel is always so vague about it." I said, "I work in logistics finance, private equity primarily." She tilted her head. "And that's been sustainable for you?" There was a pause, the kind that's designed to be filled by defensiveness. I said, "Yes, it has been." She set down her fork, folded her hands, and then, with the pleasant expression of someone delivering a weather report, she said, "I only ask because Daniel has a certain standard of living and a certain family expectation, and we've always hoped that whoever he built his life with would be established in a way that was compatible." She looked at my dress. It was a good dress, a very good dress, but it wasn't a dress that announced itself, and that, I understood, was the verdict. I didn't look like their idea of enough. Ray laughed quietly at something Greg said beside him. Beth was examining her wine glass. Caroline was watching me with the careful attention of someone waiting to see if I'd cry. Daniel said, "Mom," quietly, and with the particular restraint of a man who has been having this argument internally for years. Pamela continued, "I'm not trying to be unkind. I'm simply saying that this table represents a lot of hard work and a lot of history, and we want Daniel's future to reflect that." And there it was, the table. The implication that I was seated at it on a kind of probationary basis, that my presence was conditional on an audition I was, by the standards of that room, already failing. I looked at her for a moment. Then I put my napkin on my chair, smiled, and said, "Excuse me for just a moment." I walked to the front hallway. I took out my phone. I called Douglas Aldrin. He picked up on the second ring because Douglas has always, in 11 years, picked up on the second ring. I said, "Douglas, quick question. The Whitmore Regional acquisition, that's still under Aldrin's portfolio, correct?" He said, "Yes, fully integrated as of Q2. Why?" I said, "Just confirming something. Who's the current operational contact over there?" He gave me a name I already knew. Then he said, "Is everything okay?" I said, "Yes, everything is fine. I'll explain later. Merry Christmas." He said, "Merry Christmas, Renata." And then, because Douglas has known me long enough to read a 4-minute phone call, he said, "Be careful." I put my phone in my bag. I took a breath. I checked my reflection in the hallway mirror, not because I needed to, but because it is a thing I do when I need to remind myself of who I am before I walk back into a room. I walked back in. I sat down. I unfolded my napkin and placed it in my lap and reached for my wine glass. Pamela was telling a story about a cruise she and Gerald had taken the previous spring. I listened. I nodded at the appropriate moments. I let the conversation finish the arc it was on. Then Gerald mentioned the company. It was a toast. He stood at the head of the table with his glass raised and said that he was grateful for another year, for his family's health, for the fact that Whitmore Regional had come through its acquisition in good shape, that the new parent company had proven to be a steady and professional operation, and that everyone around this table who had built careers within that structure should feel proud. Ray and Greg both raised their glasses. So did Stephanie. So did Tom, whose own firm handled some insurance contracts adjacent to Whitmore's book of business. Daniel was looking at me. I don't know what he saw in my face. Something, I think. Something careful. I raised my glass with everyone else. I said, "Here, here," quietly. Then Pamela looked at me over the rim of her glass and said, with the smile of someone finishing a sentence she'd started an hour hour ago? You know, Renata, perhaps someday you'll understand what it means to be part of something that has real permanence, a real institution, not just finance work that comes and goes. The table was very quiet. I set my glass down. I looked at Pamela Whitmore. I looked at Gerald. I looked at Ray and Greg and Caroline and Beth and Tom and Stephanie, all of them looking back at me with varying degrees of anticipation. Then I reached into my bag. I took out my wallet. I removed the matte black card from behind my license and set it on the table in front of Gerald's plate. Face up, I said. I want to make sure I understand you correctly, Pamela. You're saying the company that acquired Whitmore Regional is a real institution with permanence. She blinked. Yes, it's been a stable and professional operation, she said, repeating Gerald's words with a slight softening. I said, I agree. I helped build it. Gerald picked up the card. He read it. His expression did something I can only describe as a controlled collapse. The face of a man who has understood something and is processing the distance between what he said an hour ago and where he is now. He said, Aldrin Ventures. I said, yes. He said, you're the CFO. I said, co-founder and CFO. My name is on the founding documents. Has been since the beginning. The room had the specific quality of a clock that has stopped ticking. Everyone could feel the absence of the sound they'd gotten used to. Pamela said, slowly, that can't be right. I said, it is right. I'd be happy to show you the LLC filing if you'd like. I have it on my phone. She didn't say anything. I said, the parent company that Gerald toasted just now, the stable and professional operation that Ray and Greg and Stephanie are employed by, has my name on its founding deed. That has been true for 6 years. I did not mention it because it was not relevant. I am mentioning it now because you made it relevant. Daniel drove us home. We didn't speak for the first 15 minutes. Then he said, how long have you known about the acquisition? I said, 18 months. He said, and you didn't tell me. I said, I was going to tell you over New Year's. I wanted to be known as a person first. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, I understand that. I hate that it came out like that, but I understand that. I said, I'm sorry for not telling you sooner. That part was mine to do differently. He said, my mother. I said, I know. We drove the rest of the way in silence, but it was not a bad silence. It was the kind that two people sit in when they are deciding together that they are going to keep going. What happened next was not something I engineered. I want to be clear about that, because the version of this story that is easiest to tell is the one where I planned all of it, where I walked into that house with a strategy and executed it. That is not what happened. What happened is that I spent a year trying to earn a seat at a table that had already decided I didn't belong, and then I showed one card, one true thing about myself, and the table rearranged itself around it without any help from me. The Monday after Christmas, Gerald received a call from the Aldrin Ventures operational contact at Whitmore Regional. It was a routine call, a quarterly check-in, nothing unusual. But Gerald, being Gerald, asked the contact directly whether he knew a woman named Renata Osei. The contact said, yes, she's one of our co-founders. I report to her quarterly on the Whitmore integration. Gerald apparently thanked him and ended the call. He called Daniel that afternoon and said simply, I owe Renata an apology. I will deliver it in person. Pamela did not call. I did not expect her to. What I did not anticipate, and what I want to be honest about because I am not proud of it exactly, but I am not ashamed of it either, was the HR review. In January, as part of a standard post-integration compliance audit that had been scheduled for months, the Aldrin operational team reviewed compensation equity and contract status across all Whitmore regional staff. 3 positions were found to be filled by individuals whose hiring had not followed standard documented process. One was Ray, one was Stephanie, one was a second-tier operations manager who turned out to be Gerald's college roommate's son, hired 6 months before the acquisition without a posting or interview record. I was not in the room for those decisions. I was not asked for my input. The audit was conducted by the compliance team, reported to Douglas, and handled through standard protocol. I recused myself entirely from any decisions that touched Whitmore Regional that month and disclosed my personal connection to Douglas in writing. All 3 positions were eliminated by February 1st. Ray called Daniel, not me, and left a voicemail that was long and furious and ended with a line about snakes in the grass that I think was intended to be pointed at me. Daniel played it for me on speaker, and we both sat with it for a moment. Then he deleted it. I want to tell you that I felt nothing. That would make a cleaner story. The truth is, I felt something complicated, a mix of vindication and grief, because I had not wanted any of this. I had wanted to be someone's daughter-in-law. I had wanted Christmas dinners where nobody was performing anything. I had wanted to be ordinary in that room, and I had been told explicitly that I was not enough for it. And then the floor had opened up under the people who said it, and that is not the same as winning. Winning would have been Pamela looking at me over that dinner table and seeing a person. That never happened. That is the thing I carry. Daniel proposed in April. We were in my kitchen, a Sunday morning, coffee, and the kind of ordinary quiet I have come to understand is the actual foundation of love. Not the dramatic moments, but the unremarkable ones you keep choosing. He had a ring that had belonged to his paternal grandmother, a simple gold band with a small sapphire, which I later learned he had quietly retrieved from a safety deposit box at Christmas. Before the dinner, before any of it, he had planned to ask me over New Year's. We are getting married in September. Gerald came to dinner at my mother's house in March. He brought flowers and a bottle of wine, and he sat at her table, and he said to both of us that he had raised his wife and his children to value certain things that had made them small in ways he hadn't seen clearly enough until someone came along who was larger than the values they built. He said it plainly, without performance, and my mother, who has a finely calibrated sense for when a man is being genuine, thanked him for coming. Pamela has not reached out. Daniel has spoken to her twice by phone. Those conversations are his to describe, not mine. What I know is that she sent a card when the engagement was announced. The handwriting was careful. The message was 3 sentences. The last one said she hoped to know me better in time. I have kept the card, not as evidence, not as leverage, just as a record of where a door cracked open. My mother has a saying she picked up somewhere, from a book or a neighbor, or the particular radio station she played on Saturday mornings when I was small. She used to say it to Marcus and me when we came home from something that had gone wrong and were trying to understand why. She would say, "Baby, the table was never theirs to offer you. You were always already seated." I did not understand that at 9. I understand it now. I did not need Pamela Whitmore's permission to be at that table. I had been building the table, the actual table, the company behind the Christmas dinner for 6 years. I just hadn't said so yet. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do in a room full of people who have decided you are not enough is simply to let the truth arrive quietly, on your own schedule, on a matte black card with silver print, and then put your napkin back in your lap, reach for your wine, and let the room figure out the rest.